Welcome to today's Explainer. So, if you've ever even glanced at a college philosophy syllabus, there's a really good chance you've heard of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Published way back in 1807, this thing has an absolutely terrifying reputation. I mean, it is widely considered one of the most difficult, dense, and frankly intimidating books in all of Western philosophy. But today, we are going to look at this masterpiece through a completely different lens. Let's just totally forget the dry academic theory for a bit. We are going to explore this book for what it truly is at its core, an epic, dynamic, coming-of-age story. Except the protagonist isn't a person. The protagonist is human consciousness itself. Let's start right off by demystifying that incredibly intimidating title. Phenomenology is simply the study of phenomena, which really just means studying things as they appear to us. And spirit? Well, that's translated from the German word Geist. And no, he's not talking about a literal ghost. By spirit, Hegel means the shared, evolving consciousness and culture of humanity. So you put all that together, and what you actually have is the story of how human consciousness appears to itself. It's about how it stumbles, makes huge mistakes, and then slowly, painfully learns from them to understand its ultimate place in the universe. Really, it's a giant puzzle about how humanity actually grows up. Part 1, the mind's coming of age. Imagine our protagonist, consciousness, starting entirely from scratch. It is a total blank slate, trying to find objective truth without relying on a single prior assumption. Think of consciousness here like a newborn baby. It looks at the world and thinks, okay, the most real thing in the world is exactly what I can point to right here, right now. It points to a tree and says, this is real here and now. But, as Hegel brilliantly shows us, the very moment you try to lock that down, it just slips right through your fingers. Think about it. If you take a piece of paper and write down, now is night, it feels totally true, right? But read that exact same piece of paper at noon the next day, and it's completely false. You turn around, and suddenly, here is no longer a tree, it's a house. Words like here and now are just way too general to capture absolute concrete reality. Pure sensory experience completely fails because it's totally unstable. So consciousness hits a dead end. But how does it move forward? Part 2, the engine of progress. The fundamental mechanism that drives our protagonist's growth every single time it hits one of these inevitable dead ends is the famous dialectic. For Hegel, human progress does not happen in a nice, neat, straight line. No way. It happens through a messy cycle of trial, error, and conflict. First, we have the stage of certainty, often called the thesis. This is where the mind holds a belief and thinks, yep, this is completely true. Second comes the stage of contradiction or antithesis. The mind acts on that belief, totally hits a wall, and experiences crisis and real pain. And finally, we reach the stage of reconciliation or synthesis. So the absolutely crucial point is what actually happens in that final step of reconciliation, which Hegel calls sublation or Aufhebung in German. When the mind hits a brutal contradiction, it doesn't just throw away its old belief like garbage. Instead, it does three things. It cancels out the mistake, preserves whatever was actually true about it, and lifts the entire concept up to a higher, more sophisticated level. The mind literally never wastes its past. It carries its hard-won lessons forward. And using this exact engine, consciousness realizes that the physical world of objects just isn't enough to satisfy it anymore. To really understand the world, it realizes it has to turn inward. Part 3, the struggle for recognition. This inward turn brings us to what is easily one of the most famous ideas in all of philosophy, the master-slave dialectic. Just imagine two primitive humans meeting out in the wilderness. Both of them desperately want to be recognized as the supreme center of the universe. So they fight. One risks their life, wins, and becomes the master. The other, terrified of dying, submits and becomes the slave. At first glance, you'd think the master wins, right? But consider the contrast here. The master's victory is totally hollow. They wanted recognition from a peer, from an equal, but they are only being recognized by a slave. Worse than that, the master just lounges around all day and becomes completely passively dependent on the slave for their own survival. But what about the slave? The slave is forced to work. By shaping wood, planting crops, and physically changing reality, the slave realizes, wow, my mind can actually shape the world. In this incredibly brilliant irony, it is the slave who actually develops self-awareness, discipline, and true independence through their labor. But wait, realizing your inner freedom doesn't instantly magically change the harsh physical world around you. So how does the mind cope with physical suffering? Well, it tries to retreat into these totally self-denying mental traps. First, it tries stoicism. basically deciding that external reality simply doesn't matter. But that just ends up feeling cold and empty. Then it swings over to skepticism, literally claiming nothing is real at all, which, is a complete logical contradiction. Finally, it falls into what Hegel calls the unhappy consciousness. This is basically the mindset of medieval religion, where the mind splits reality straight down the middle. It projects all perfection and goodness onto a distant, unreachable God, while viewing its own earthly physical existence as totally worthless and sinful. But eventually, thank goodness, the mind just gets tired of hating itself. It finally realizes that if it exists in the universe, it must have inherent value. Part 4: Reason, Society, and Spirit. At this point, the mind upgrades to reason. It realizes that the world can actually be understood and categorized. Reason kicks off with this massive explosion of scientific curiosity. It categorizes plants, animals, and desperately tries to find absolute laws for everything. But it kind of goes a bit too far. In Hegel's time, there was this popular pseudoscience called phrenology, which claimed you could completely understand a human's personality just by measuring the physical bumps on their skull. Hegel uses this absolutely biting, hilarious quote to mock them: "The spirit is a bone." He's being entirely sarcastic here. He's pointing out the sheer absurdity of trying to reduce living, dynamic, creative human freedom to a dead, static piece of matter. The mind is an active, ongoing process, not just some object you can measure with a ruler. This profound realization pushes consciousness entirely out of the isolated individual's head and right into the shared, collective world of culture and history. We have finally reached the stage of spirit. Let's trace how this builds across Western civilization. Back in the ancient Greek era, there was this really beautiful but ultimately fragile and unreflective harmony between the family and the state. But as we know, that harmony inevitably shatters, which thrusts individuals into the Enlightenment era. This is a time of modernity and cold cultural alienation, where suddenly everything is viewed as just a machine or a utility. And this deep alienation leads to a truly terrifying climax. The Enlightenment demanded what it called absolute freedom, this fierce refusal to accept any institution, government, or class that the individual didn't personally, actively choose. This is the exact mindset that fueled the French Revolution. But here is the brutal paradox Hegel points out. If you demand pure, abstract, uncompromised freedom, you can literally never build concrete laws or institutions, because by definition, any law restricts freedom. Therefore, absolute freedom can only do one single thing: destroy its rivals. This abstract logic led directly to the bloodbath of the Reign of Terror. And Hegel captures the chilling, absolute horror of this with a shockingly dark observation. To these revolutionaries, killing a human being suddenly had no more significance than, quote, cleaving a head of cabbage. Totally horrified by all that bloodshed, Spirit retreats once again, this time hiding out in personal morality. But this just creates a massive moral deadlock. On one side, you have what Hegel calls the beautiful soul. This is a person so incredibly obsessed with keeping their own hands morally clean that they just sit up in an ivory tower and refuse to ever act in the real messy world. On the other side, you have the active person, the one who actually gets their hands dirty trying to change things, but is instantly judged and labeled a hypocrite by that beautiful soul. So how on earth do we break this deadlock? It happens through mutual confession and forgiveness. The active person steps up and confesses their flaws and selfish motives, and the judge, suddenly recognizing their own arrogant pride and inaction, forgives them. In this deeply moving realization, they both see that humans are fundamentally limited and flawed. True community and true spirit is born precisely out of this mutual grace. But before humanity had the strict philosophical logic to explain all of this evolution, it had to use myths, stories, and images to represent its own journey. This is the realm of religion, and Hegel maps this out chronologically too. In natural religion, early humanity saw the divine as massive, overwhelming natural forces, like the sun. Then, in the classical Greek era, art religion portrayed the gods as idealized humans in marble statues, slowly realizing that the divine actually reflects human traits. Finally, in revealed religion, the story of the Incarnation and the Holy Spirit serves as a perfect metaphor for the ultimate truth. The divine isn't some distant king sitting on a cloud. It is realized right here in the loving, rational, day-to-day community of human beings working together. And that profound, grounding realization finally brings our protagonist to the climax of the entire journey. Part 5: Reaching Absolute Knowing. Now listen, absolute knowing isn't some magical superpower where you suddenly know the winning lottery numbers or the answer to every scientific equation. It's much, much more of a twist ending. As Hegel puts it, the true is the whole. Consciousness looks back at literally everything we've just covered, the sensory failures, the master-slave struggle, the French Revolution, the religious myths, and realizes that absolutely none of it was an accident. The mind wasn't looking out at alien forces ruling over it. It was looking in a mirror all along. Every single painful error, every conflict and contradiction was humanity struggling, learning, and actively building itself. The whole messy, painful process was completely necessary to achieve genuine freedom. Which brings us to the final and, frankly, perhaps the most important question: why does this massive 19th century philosophical framework actually matter to you right now? Part 6. Why Hegel matters today. Let's just cut right through all that dense academic jargon and see the real practical value here. When Hegel says spirit, remember, he isn't talking about ghosts. He literally means our collective culture. When he says dialectic, it isn't just some fancy debate style. It's the natural, fundamental engine of how we actually grow through our failures. And sublation? It isn't about throwing your past away. It's about lifting the good parts of your past mistakes up to a much higher, more mature level. If we apply those concepts to our lives, we get 3 incredibly powerful takeaways. First, we are deeply historical creatures. Your mind, your thoughts, your values, they are deeply shaped by the specific era and culture you live in. Second, pain and contradiction, they're features of growth, not bugs. You literally cannot achieve wisdom or maturity without making mistakes and facing conflicts head-on. And third, true freedom is not just doing whatever you want on an isolated desert island. True freedom is inherently social and communal. It only really exists when we participate in a rational community where we actively recognize and respect each other. Which leaves us with this final thought. We've seen how humanity has moved from simple sense certainty through the intense master-slave dynamic, through the sheer terror of abstract freedom, all the way to the realization of shared spirit. But the dialectic doesn't just stop. It is the ongoing, never-ending engine of human progress. So looking around at the massive cultural complex, the insane technological leaps, and the deep contradictions we are all facing today, what stage of this painful, beautiful coming-of-age story is our society in right now? Think about it. I really hope this explainer helped you see the world just a little bit differently today. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey.
Please like and subscribe.